I'm so excited to welcome to the HXD stage our next speaker, Taylor Cashdan. He is a user experience designer from Fidelity Investments, and he's going to dive headfirst into a topic we were just talking about, stress, and how it affects our bodies and how we can best manage it. So please welcome Taylor Cashdan.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks again, Amy and Mad Pow, for the introduction and for having me at this great event. And more specifically, I want to thank all of you for coming. I added this particular gift at the beginning of this talk in May of 2020, and back then it kind of felt weird to add it, but now it just feels like an average day, and I'm sure many of you can relate, which I don't know how I feel about, but alas, we're here. I'm going to start things off telling you a little about myself and how I got here, and then I'll talk a little about the way the brain works, I'll tell you a story, and then I'll close with some things I've learned. As mentioned earlier, my name is Taylor Cashdan. I'm currently a senior UX designer at Fidelity Investments, working on design systems and UX patterns, and I also just recently wrapped up a 5-year stint of involvement with my Raleigh Chapter A of AIGA. When in-person events were still a thing, I hosted a live art competition called Basement Battle, and I run a coffee-inspired brand called Black Soul Club on the side. I'm also a curriculum advisor for HackerU and an active mentor through ADP List, and I try to sneak in a freelance gig here and then when I can, aside from also doing these talks and things like this. Now, I don't show and tell you all this to brag, but to tee up a dangerous, but now under control, pattern of over-involvement. But to understand that, we have to go way back. So I was born in the center of Long Island, New York, and in 2003, in search of a more sustainable lifestyle and to escape some of the New York grind, my family moved to North Carolina right as I was finishing up the 5th grade. Starting middle school and high school in North Carolina, I was part of every club that would accept me and every extracurricular we could afford. My parents were not the kind of people that would ship their kids off to keep busy. I just genuinely enjoyed having a packed schedule and constantly wanted to be involved with the things around me. And when I got into college, I was no different. I was a full-time student, an editor and contributor to the college newspaper. I was starting to take on freelance gigs, and I had a contract job with HBO doing field marketing for the Raleigh-Durham area. As I left college and entered the professional world, I started to sub out these activities for other activities, often simply adding to that list. Full-time job, freelancing, helping run events and meetup groups, becoming more active in professional organizations, etc., etc. And it was only then that I started to realize I had an addiction. I was addicted to stress. I enjoyed it. I threw myself into high-pressure situations with different sets of constraints. And I'd let all of those things compound, creating one self-imposed enormous to-do list. I was addicted to cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It's created by our adrenal glands. And when cortisol is released into your bloodstream, it can act on different parts of the body to help it deal with stress or danger or things like that. It's the chemical that's directly attributed with the way our bodies respond to fight, flight, or freeze scenarios. But let's level set. My dependency on cortisol was not at the production level, meaning my body doesn't over or underproduce the chemical itself. There's actual medical conditions where this happens. But I like to gamble on the way my body would respond to cortisol. By overcommitting myself, I was banking on the fact that I would get stressed out and always choose the fight part of that fight, flight, or freeze. The hope being that this fight would then manifest into some super transformed state of creativity and I'd crush whatever I was working on. And because I was a serial procrastinator, this is what I was doing with everything, all the time. Now, the challenge here being, for the longest time, it seemed effective. I was meeting all my deadlines at work. I was creating cool stuff. I was exceeding expectations both at the job and with clients and so forth. So this continual stress, to me, was simply triggering my flow state, and I thought I was performing at my personal best. Which, when you think about it, is super ironic because there's a plethora of research that says in the midst of stress, our amygdala, the decision-making emotion center of our brain, are less capable of thoughtful, future-oriented thought than when we're not stressed out. Our brains are literally wired to deal with what's called present threat, even if we intellectually acknowledge that delaying another task would just simply lead to more stress. Researchers call this phenomenon the amygdala hijack. There's so much research into this phenomena that people like Dr. Fuchsia Soroy, a professor of psychology at the University of Sheffield, is on record in studies saying when we procrastinate, we're not only aware that we're avoiding the task in question, but also that doing so is probably a bad idea, and yet we do it anyway. This is why performance as a metric is so interesting to try and track, especially when you try to tie it to creative output, since there's just so many different factors. Adobe and IDC put out a survey that said 71% of creatives produce 10 times more content than they did just 5 years ago, which is really, really interesting considering the sheer number of new tools that are out there, new content mediums, new disciplines you can work under, etc. But it's worth mentioning that this particular study was from 2015. So now I read the statistic as 71% of creatives, us, are responsible for producing 10 times more content than we did 5 years ago. And that is terrifying. To give a wider workplace context, LinkedIn just recently reported from a Pulse survey in April of 2019 that 49% of workers today feel stress at their job. That's almost half of our workforce experiencing stressful pressures enough to quantify a voluntary survey. And the biggest reported drivers, of no surprise, work-life balance and workload. And to add an even more recent set of data, Adweek and Adobe Stock recently released a report about a year ago that they called The State of Creativity. Their research calls out that even despite a global pandemic, massive social justice activation, and a roller coaster election season, 81% of participants reported currently being asked to develop more content in less time. Content often defined in a myriad of ways, whether it be tangible content, digital content, experiences, etc. Even pre-2020, these reports point to us not only working way more, but being prone to higher and increased levels of general anxiety, which in turn turns into toxic forms of comparison, which we commonly call the comparison trap, right? Where we get stuck in loops, comparing ourselves to others we work with, admire, follow on social media, etc., not acknowledging that those journeys and interests and skill sets and learning styles are often different. Or, even worse, the Superman syndrome, right? Where the feeling that you have to swoop in and save the day because if you don't, no one else will. All of this equates to added pressure and stress to our daily lives. Now, some of this, unfortunately, outside of the workplace context, we brought upon ourselves by nurturing and encouraging this idea of the hustle mentality, right? And we hear it more than we think. Practice, practice, practice. Just put more hours in, etc. There was a study published in March 2019 by the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stress that quantifies that rest, early and often, plays just as important of a role in cognitive function and learning new behaviors as this whole practice, practice, practice mentality we've been preaching all these years. But rhetoric we see and hear from what's dubbed as motivational content on the internet or sometimes conference talks are more often than not about optimizing your time or hacking your schedule. There's no definitive attribution for this quote, but many of you have heard the phrase, find a job you like and you'll never work a day in your life, right? Pretty common. But I like the version from Adam J. Kurtz better. It says, do what you love and you'll work super fucking hard all the time with no separation or any boundaries and also take everything extremely personally. Now, for some reason, this version feels way more accurate. But when did we make this shift? When did we decide that you should never turn your brain off, put the pencil down, or give yourself time to breathe? Who decided that monetizing your hobbies and having side hustles were mandatory or even the right thing to do for everybody? Not to mention the implication that if you're not working yourself to death, then you're not being productive. It's a toxic way of viewing work ethic, but when we're only hearing from those who've made it via these content that we're helping create, it makes sense that such storytelling would only idolize the struggle. We say and feel things like, if you're not freelancing enough, you're not really creating enough. If you don't have a passion project, you're not exploring enough. Or if you don't have a side hustle, then you're not serious about your craft. What we seem to constantly forget is that we don't need to do everything to feel fulfillment, and we don't have to stress ourselves out to make work that matters. We shouldn't try to keep busy in an effort to counter the lack of fulfillment we're getting from the things we're doing and the people we're with. The whole, if you're not doing everything, then you're basically doing nothing mantra needs to die. Now, the irony is a few years ago, I was the worst culprit. I want to tell you a story, but first, I want to take a heart rate reading together. So for those of you with smartwatches, do me a favor and activate your little heart rate reader. For those of you without, you can hold 2 fingers against your wrist, kind of under this little nook right beneath your thumb bone here, or underneath your jaw. And when you can feel a pulse, you're on the right spot. So I'll give you a second to find that. Now, when I say go, we're going to count the beats for 15 seconds, and I'll keep track of time. You keep track of your beats, and keep counting until I say stop. Ready, set, go. Great, stop. Cool. Now take that number and multiply it by 4. Use your phone, use pen and paper, use a calculator, whatever. No one's judging you. Now you have your resting heart rate. The average adult resting heart rate is between 60 and 90 beats per minute. Now that's sometimes a little lower for those more athletically fit, or a little higher for folks that just had coffee, or you just finished a meal, or you just ran around and sat down dealing with kids, etc. But if your heart rate fell within that range, it should sound something like this. Right? On June 29th, 2017, I woke up dizzy, disoriented, and drenched in sweat, with both my head and my chest pounding. Assuming I had a nightmare or just slept terribly, I wandered into my bathroom to try to snap myself out of the state I was in to try and get ready for work. So I washed my face, took a shower, started grabbing my stuff, collecting my things. The dizziness eventually faded, and as did the disorientation and sweat, considering I just took a shower, but I still had this weird pitter patter happening in my chest. Thinking nothing of it, I instinctually texted my mom that my chest felt funny and then proceeded to work. When I sat down at my desk, I was both winded and full of energy, which was a really weird combination of feelings. And that pitter patter from before was still serving as quite the distraction. So I called a coworker into my office, prefacing that I had a really bizarre request. I asked them to put their hand on my chest like this to see if they were able to feel the sporadic twitching that I was feeling, just to make sure I wasn't going nuts. And when they confirmed my suspicion, it was clear to me that it was time to act. So I first went to my doctor, who at that particular job was right around the corner, which was super convenient. He couldn't pinpoint what was happening and recommended I head to the hospital. Instead of waiting and paying for an ambulance, I drove myself to the ER. Now, when I arrived at the hospital, the doctor had called ahead, and it was practically all hands on deck. There was doctors and nurses and folks all surrounding me, applying little electrocardiogram stickies and setting up IV needles and hooking up oxygen tanks and putting me in a wheelchair. It was only at that point that I realized that I had a resting heart rate of almost 180 beats per minute. Now, just to make that clear, remember the heart rate from before, that steady between 60 and 90 BPM? Oftentimes it looks like this on an electrocardiogram report and sounds like this, right? This is an EKG. It's the readout report from those little nodes, and it shows your heart rate. This one's mine. That's 70 per minute from another time in that day. This is what my heart should have sounded while sitting stationary in that wheelchair or when they moved me to that bed. But instead, it sounded more like this. Now, these are both EKG reports of mine from that morning. And you can see when I overlaid them just how fast my heart rate was. The red one being the 180 and the black underlay being the 75. There's almost 2 beats for every one when you look at the red line. So the first thing to try was to see if they can chemically get my heart back into rhythm using the IV needles they had put in. And when that didn't work, it was apparent that it was time to update mom. Now, general note here, nothing good comes from starting the morning with I'm having chest pains and then minimal contact after that. Now, knowing I'd been less than transparent, and if I underwent any procedure without at least giving my mom a heads up, I'd likely leave the hospital in worse condition than I was admitted, I figured it was time to give her a call. The other interesting thing to mention here is that my mom had just had knee surgery, so she couldn't even drive. She literally had to call an Uber. My stepdad wasn't available, my brother and sister weren't picking up the phone, and when I decided to call, the doctors were already ready to go. But mom wasn't there yet, so I couldn't give the green light. And frankly, to be honest, I was really scared. The next step was to put me under and shock my heart back into rhythm with those, kind of like the paddles that they use to resuscitate people. Now, once she did arrive about 10, 15 minutes later, it was time to put me under. 3 shocks later of increasing strength, no luck, which resulted in a 2-day staycation at the hospital under constant observation, which meant a lot of blood tests, scans, pricks, prods, and about 100 of those little sticky pads they use for the EKG notes. Now, mind you, I'm of Italian and Middle Eastern descent. Chest hair plus those 3M sticky pads is not an ideal way of spending a Thursday. The diagnosis, after passing all of the other tests with a clean bill of health? Stress-induced atrial fibrillation, or AFib for short. Meaning instead of being sent signals of when to hit the drum by the conductor, each chamber decided whenever it felt like that it was time for a drum solo. The tricky thing about AFib is there really isn't much that can be done to monitor or treat it unless you're currently experiencing the arrhythmia, an arrhythmia being an irregular heartbeat. Doctors can speculate and make predictions, but when the normal causes, drugs, above 60 years old, poor health, obesity, diabetes, etc., are ruled out, it's kind of just up your body to do its own thing. Since that first instance in June of 2017, I've experienced 3 arrhythmia events, one of which my body worked itself out of by the time I got checked into the ER, one I had to get zapped to fix, and one I was able to regulate with breathing exercises and some on-the-spot medication. The part that's even more weird, to the doctors at least, is these events, in my case, weren't triggered by any kind of event, like a family problem, missed deadline, shocking news, things that would generally startle your body. I literally woke up in these accelerated rhythms from a dead sleep. This whole experience flipped my productivity game on its head. I was always that I do my best work under pressure kind of guy, the whole I'll channel my stress of everything going on into that flow state kind of person. And it's well known that stress is often an intro or gateway to other forms of addiction, albeit drugs, bad habits, poor choices, etc. So in tandem, I thought maybe it was possible that my stress had caused a loop in which I craved more stress instead of ways to cope with the stress I was already experiencing. And being that my stress seemingly had a positive output, productivity, maybe my brain misread this as false Maybe my brain misread this false positive as a healthy behavior. Arguably, I was using a derivative of the self-medication theory to cope with my stress, which simply suggests that people who are under increased stress are more likely to turn to things like drugs or other means as a way to decrease said stress. My drug was my to-do list. The more I had, the better I thought I'd feel. My brain didn't know how to regulate the stress I was already experiencing, so instead I drowned it out with more work because it felt something I could control. I was controlling the commitment. So essentially, I created my own little toxic loop that I seemingly couldn't break. Now, I read a quote from author and stress management specialist Debbie Mandel that reads, "Stress robs you of your identity, but doing what you love helps you reclaim it," which I think is a really interesting sentiment, but it's not always the easiest thing to do because it also almost accidentally encourages overwork. For a few weeks after my diagnosis, I was a bit of a wreck. On the outside, I seemed calm and collected, but internally, anytime I even thought I was feeling weird or feeling my heart do something funny, I'd immediately check my pulse. Some of my family and friends noticed and asked me about it, but I don't think I was ready to address it, so I kind of just shook it off. I even figured I could solve my heart rate check obsession with technology, figuring I'd get an Apple Watch. And to be honest, it gave me a sense of relief, because a good portion of the time that I was manually checking my heart rate, it was just phantom feelings, meaning it was kind of in my head. But with technology on my side, I figured if there was a real emergency, it would catch it first. This little crutch empowered me to worry less, which is ultimately for the better. But if my AFib diagnosis has taught me anything, it's that all of this could have been avoided with 4 pretty basic steps. The first step, ask. You have to ask yourself the tough questions, and these questions should cover 3 pretty basic constructs. You have to first ask yourself about your tasks. Do you really have to do it all? Are all of these things necessary right now? The second thing is the people around you. Ask yourself about them. Are they the right people? Do they encourage your success? And the third is, what's your plan, right? How does what you're doing and who you're doing it with lead to the next thing? Are you running around like a chicken without a head, or is there some kind of method to your madness? Asking yourself the tough questions leads to less stress. The second step, which builds on the first, is to say, fuck it. It's time to trim the fat. If you really don't need to be taking on all of that work or all those tasks, it's time to start saying no. No to the projects you don't have interest in, no to the tasks that will overload you, and no to the plans that you really don't want to participate in. On this same note, sometimes you have to say fuck it to the people in your circle that breathe nothing but stagnation and negativity, especially if they're not building you up and you them. Your circle should be the ones clapping the loudest when you have successes and be there to mentor you through your failures. If they're not, it's time for a new circle. And lastly, is your plan the right plan? Does it include the right pieces? No? Fuck it. Saying fuck it means less stress. Plus, foul language is fun. The flip side to step 2 is step 3. Incubate. It's time to double down on the things that move the needle, the people and the places and the things that make you happy. You can do this by incubating your time, your things, and your circle. Let's say you had 2 hours of time and your original plan was to pick 2 projects to start. Currently, the options on the table seem like one you like and one you don't. And your normal plan of attack would be to split the time between those 2 because there's likely some value in getting both done. And most people, when surveyed about this exact kind of scenario for a study published in the March 2017 issue of Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, said that they would not only start both, but they would switch back and forth at their leisure whenever they felt creatively blocked. I say no. Double down and give those 2 hours to the one thing that brings you joy and actually furthers your goals. Research from this study and others like it explain that our brains are not effective when constantly multitasking. The constant multitasking can lead to what's called decision fatigue. Now, new data has shown, though, when it comes to creative problem solving specifically, things like the Pomodoro method, where you have intervals of focused work interspersed by short breaks, allows our brain to intentionally switch between convergent and divergent thinking. Meaning, technically, you can incubate your time through intentionality, but it requires far more diligence and practice. Incubation also extends back to the people you surround yourself with. There's another speaker whose name is Jim Rohn, who's attributed with saying, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. It's time you curate and nurture your circle so that you can help each other succeed. Celebrate your circle's wins as if they were your own, and give more than you take. Incubating the things you enjoy leads to less stress. The last is the simplest to explain, but the hardest to do. Learn to just be. Be intentional about the choices you make, the tasks you take on, and the actions you carry out. And be present when making those decisions, working on those tasks, and doing those things. According to Lauren Roche, PhD, a meditation instructor and author, there's over 100 types of meditative practices. He says something like karaoke is a good gateway to meditation. It's a joyous expression followed by relief. He goes on to say that individuals should pick an aspect of their life that they love and build a meditative practice around that. Practicing mental health does not mean sitting with your legs crossed saying Om and trying to clear your head. Roche says it's through welcoming tension that you release it. Being wholly present and intentional as much as possible leads to less stress. So I think we can all use a little of AFib in our lives, but I don't necessarily mean this kind where your heart rate's going nuts like mine, but I mean this kind. It's important to remember that none of this happens overnight, though. I've been trying to live by these principles since my hospital staycation and still had 3 episodes afterwards. It's a process, but now I'm almost 3 years without an incident. And the truth is, I'm really no expert. But I have learned that you have to be patient with yourself and give yourself time to adjust, and more importantly, your body to adapt. And this is even more true right now when many of us are juggling a whole new slew of stressors for an extended period of time. The pressure of home and family life is ever more in time with our normal standards of work. Jenny Japp, a comedian and executive producer, she put it best. She said, "You're only unproductive by the standards of the world that we lived in now over a year ago." And that world is gone. And what's funny is the original quote that I pulled said 3 months. And you can imagine how much time has flown, right? And how it's just going to continue this way for seemingly a little bit longer. We have to be diligent and aware of ourselves as much as possible. How we're feeling, what we're doing, how we're reacting or coping, and more importantly, how we're treating others. This isn't something unique to the time we're currently in, but it is especially important during times of continued fluctuation. Now, I saw something recently that I thought was worth sharing. It's a tweet from writer and actor Brandon Kyle Goodman. It reads, "I told my friend I'm emotionally hitting a wall, and she said, sometimes walls are there so we can lean on them and rest. I can't even begin to express how much I really needed to hear that." What's so interesting about this to me is how truly relatable it is, and how fast we are to think we have to hurdle that wall or power through it instead of embracing some rest. What's even more interesting is we don't treat other things in our life with this power through mentality, right? When an engine is overheating or your pasta's boiling over, you don't add more to the throttle or increase the heat. You ease off. So I want to challenge you to find ways to lean against that wall, to give yourself some time to rest. There's one last quote that doesn't seem to have a definitive origin, but I really like it. It's a nice way to wrap this up. And it goes, "Destroy the idea that you have to be constantly working or grinding in order to be successful. Embrace the concept that rest, recovery, and reflection are essential parts of progress towards a successful and ultimately happy life." Nice, right? I'd encourage you to dive into some of the articles, studies, resources, statistics, etc. yourself. I link to many of them here that I've shown in the content today, as well as some other interesting things I've collected and found. The more we can collectively know, the better. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taylor.